February 1944. American bomber crews are dying over Germany at an unsustainable rate. The 8th Air Force has lost 176 bombers in just 6 days. Luftwaffe fighters swarm the skies, knowing exactly when American escorts must turn back. The generals are desperate. The solution? A metal tank bolted under a fighter's belly that everyone said would never work. They called it suicide. They said it would make fighters sitting ducks. But this 110-gallon metal canister didn't just save the P-51 Mustang, it changed the entire war in Europe. This is the story of how drop tanks turned the tide of World War II. Let me paint you a picture of what bomber crews faced in 1943. You're a 20-year-old gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress, 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany. Your mission? Bomb a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt, deep in enemy territory. You've been in the air for hours, and you know what's coming. At exactly 400 miles from the English coast, your P-47 Thunderbolt escorts waggle their wings. They're out of fuel. They have to turn back. And now you're alone, still 200 miles from the target, with hundreds of miles to fly back home. Within minutes, they appear. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, the Luftwaffe's best fighters. They know your escorts are gone. They've been tracking you on radar, waiting for this exact moment. They come in waves, from the front, the sides, above and below. Your fortress shudders as cannon shells tear through aluminum skin. On October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. That's 600 men, dead, missing, or captured. The loss rate was 26%. At that rate, bomber crews had almost no statistical chance of surviving their required 25 missions. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, faced a brutal reality. Strategic daylight bombing, the entire American air strategy in Europe, was failing. Not because the bombers weren't tough enough or the crews weren't brave enough. They were failing because fighters couldn't protect them deep into Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of 400 miles. The P-38 Lightning could stretch to maybe 450 miles. Berlin was 600 miles from England. The industrial heart of Germany, places like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin itself, sat in what bomber crews grimly called the coffin corner, beyond the reach of friendly fighters. American and British engineers had been working on a solution for years, but nobody could crack it. The answer seemed impossible. How do you make a fighter fly twice as far without making it so heavy and slow that it becomes useless? The solution they found was so simple it sounds stupid, and so controversial that pilots threatened to quit rather than use it. But before we get there, if you're enjoying this deep dive into aviation history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're building a community of history enthusiasts who want the real stories, not just the highlight reels. Now, let's talk about why everyone thought drop tanks were a death sentence. The concept of a drop tank wasn't new. It was simple, almost obvious. Attach an external fuel tank to your fighter, use that fuel first, then, when you meet the enemy, drop the empty tank and fight with your plane's normal performance. British and German engineers had experimented with drop tanks as early as the 1930s. The Japanese had actually perfected them, giving their Zero fighters incredible range across the Pacific. But in 1943, when American commanders proposed equipping fighters with drop tanks for the European theater, they ran into a wall of resistance from the pilots themselves. Fighter pilots are a particular breed. They're aggressive, confident, and obsessed with performance, and everything about drop tanks seemed to violate what made a fighter deadly. Colonel Hubert Zemke, one of the top American fighter races, initially called drop tanks an abomination. His reasoning made sense. A drop tank added weight, lots of it. A 110-gallon tank filled with fuel weighed over 700 pounds. That much extra weight made your fighter slower, less maneuverable, and sluggish in a climb. Worse, the tanks created drag. They hung below the fuselage or under the wings, disrupting the airplane's carefully designed aerodynamics. In wind tunnel tests, drop tanks reduced a P-51's top speed by 30 to 50 miles per hour. In a dogfight, 30 miles per hour could mean the difference between shooting down an enemy and getting shot down yourself. But the most terrifying concern was fire. These were essentially flying bombs strapped to your airplane. If an enemy fighter hit your drop tank with incendiary rounds, you'd become a fireball. Even if you tried to jettison the tank, the release mechanism might fail, leaving you flying a death trap. Pilots had nightmares about being unable to drop their tanks while enemy fighters closed in. The concept of a drop tank wasn't new. It was simple, almost obvious. Attach an external fuel tank to your fighter, use that fuel first, then when you meet the enemy, drop the empty tank and fight with your plane's normal performance. British and German engineers had experimented with drop tanks as early as the 1930s. The Japanese had actually perfected them, giving their Zero fighters incredible range across the Pacific. But in 1943, when American commanders proposed equipping fighters with drop tanks for the European theater, they ran into a wall of resistance from the pilots themselves. Fighter pilots are a particular breed. They're aggressive, confident, and obsessed with performance. And everything about drop tanks seemed to violate what made a fighter deadly. Colonel Hubert Zemke, one of the top American fighter races, initially called drop tanks an abomination. His reasoning made sense. A drop tank added weight, lots of it. A 110-gallon tank filled with fuel weighed over 700 pounds. That much extra weight made your fighter slower, less maneuverable, and sluggish in a climb. Worse, the tanks created drag. They hung below the fuselage or under the wings, disrupting the airplane's carefully designed aerodynamics. In wind tunnel tests, drop tanks reduced a P-51's top speed by 30 to 50 miles per hour. In a dogfight, 30 miles per hour could mean the difference between shooting down an enemy and getting shot down yourself. But the most terrifying concern was fire. These were essentially flying bombs strapped to your airplane. If an enemy fighter hit your drop tank with incendiary rounds, you'd become a fireball. Even if you tried to jettison the tank, the release mechanism might fail, leaving you flying a death trap. Pilots had nightmares about being unable to drop their tanks while enemy fighters closed in.
December 1943. The 354th Fighter Group, known as the Pioneer Mustang Group, became the first unit equipped with P-51Bs fitted with drop tanks. Their commander, Colonel Kenneth Martin, gathered his pilots for a briefing. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we're escorting heavies to Kiel. It's 450 miles each way. You'll carry drop tanks." The room erupted. Pilots argued that they'd be massacred, that the first Luftwaffe fighter they encountered would turn them into burning wreckage. Some pilots seriously considered refusing the mission. Martin made it simple. "You drop those tanks the second you see an enemy fighter. Use the fuel, drop the weight, then fight clean. This isn't about your pride. It's about bringing those bomber boys home." Quick pause. If you're finding this fascinating, smash that like button. It tells YouTube to share this video with more history fans like you. And drop a comment. Would you have trusted drop tanks if you were a fighter pilot? All right, back to the story, because what happened on these early missions changed everything. December 13th, 1943. Captain Glennon Moran led a flight of 4 P-51s, each carrying two 75-gallon drop tanks. As they climbed over the English Channel, Moran felt the sluggishness. The Mustang, normally nimble and responsive, felt heavy and awkward. Then, over the North Sea, his number 3 called out, "Bogies, 11 o'clock high!" Morin's thumb went to the drop tank jettison button. He pressed it. Nothing happened. He pressed again, panic rising. Still nothing. The mechanisms had frozen in the -40-degree cold at altitude. He was about to face Focke-Wulf 190s while carrying 150 gallons of explosive fuel under his wings. The German fighters dove. Morin did the only thing he could. He pushed his throttle to maximum power and turned into them. The P-51, even burdened with drop tanks, had one advantage: the Merlin engine. It gave him just enough speed to stay alive. After 2 desperate minutes of defensive flying, something jarred loose. His drop tanks fell away. Suddenly, Morin had a fighter again. He reversed hard, got on the tail of a Focke-Wulf, and shot it down. Back at base, mechanics swarmed his aircraft. The problem was simple. The release mechanism needed better protection against cold. They fixed it in 48 hours.
The engineering challenges were substantial. A drop tank had to be light enough not to destroy your fighter's performance, strong enough to withstand high-speed flight and combat maneuvers, aerodynamic enough not to create excessive drag, reliable enough that the jettison mechanism worked every single time, cheap enough to manufacture by the thousands. Early designs failed spectacularly. Tanks would rupture in flight, spraying fuel into the air. Release mechanisms would jam. Some tanks would tumble as they fell, smashing into the aircraft's tail. One P-38 pilot had his drop tank freeze to his wing at high altitude, unable to release it for the entire mission. But there was one person who refused to give up on drop tanks: a civilian engineer named James Howard Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, the company that built the P-51 Mustang. Kindleberger saw something others missed. Yes, drop tanks hurt performance, but only while you were carrying them. Once you jettisoned them, you had a fighter with full internal tanks and full performance, hundreds of miles deeper into enemy territory than ever before possible. He told his engineers, "I don't care if it's ugly. I don't care if pilots hate it. Make it work." They went through dozens of designs. They tested tanks made of aluminum, steel, and even paper treated with resin. They experimented with different shapes: cylindrical, teardrop, streamlined. They refined the release mechanism until it worked 99.9% of the time. By late 1943, they had it: a 110-gallon streamlined drop tank that could extend the P-51 Mustang's combat radius from 400 miles to over 650 miles. On paper, this meant P-51s could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But real theory and combat are different things. The real test would come in the skies over Germany, where Luftwaffe aces waited, eager to prove that American fighters with drop tanks were easy prey. What happened next shocked everyone. The real breakthrough came on March 4, 1944. This was the mission that changed the air war. The target, Berlin itself. For the first time, American fighters would escort bombers all the way to the Nazi capital and back, a 1,200-mile round trip. Every P-51 carried 210-gallon drop tanks plus full internal fuel. Total fuel load, 419 gallons, giving them 6 hours of flight time. Colonel Donald Blakesley led the 4th Fighter Group, the most famous American fighter unit in Europe. Blakesley was a hard-nosed combat veteran who had initially despised drop tanks. But he'd done the math. He'd seen the bomber losses, and he'd become a convert. His instructions to his pilots were now legend. We're going to Berlin. We're staying with those bombers all the way. If you lose your drop tanks and can't keep up, you're on your own. If you have engine trouble, you're on your own. But we're taking those bombers to Berlin." 738 bombers launched that morning, protected by 644 fighters. Of those fighters, 174 were P-51s with drop tanks. The formation crossed into Germany. The P-51s flew in close formation with the bombers, conserving fuel. At predetermined points, they jettisoned their drop tanks. Now flying clean, they could engage any Luftwaffe fighter that appeared. And the Luftwaffe came up in force. Over 200 German fighters attacked. But this time, something was different. Every time the Luftwaffe tried to set up an attack on the bombers, American fighters were there, deep over Germany, where they had no business being. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a P-47 pilot who had transferred to P-51s, described it. "We were over Berlin. Berlin. Me, in my fighter, over Hitler's capital. The Luftwaffe couldn't believe it. They were so shocked to see us there that we had the advantage in the first engagements. They thought we were suicidal or lost." The Americans shot down 82 German fighters that day. The bombers lost 69 aircraft, still heavy but sustainable. More importantly, the Luftwaffe lost something else: their sanctuary. For years, German fighters had operated with impunity over their own territory, knowing American escorts couldn't reach them. Now, nowhere in Germany was safe. The drop tank had extended American fighter reach across the entire Third Reich. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly said when he learned of the raid, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up."
So what made the final drop tank design work when so many others had failed? The key was the streamlined shape. Engineers at North American Aviation developed what they called the teardrop profile. Unlike earlier cylindrical tanks, this design minimized drag. Wind tunnel tests showed it created 40% less drag than cylindrical designs. The tanks were manufactured from aluminum stampings, riveted together. Each tank cost about $50 to manufacture, equivalent to about $850 today. When you consider that this $50 item could save a $50,000 bomber and its 10-man crew, the economics were obvious. The P-51 could carry drop tanks in several configurations. Two 75-gallon tanks under the wings, extended range to 850 miles combat radius. Two 110-gallon tanks under the wings, extended range to 1,000+ miles combat radius. One 110-gallon centerline tank plus two 75-gallon wing tanks, maximum ferry range of over 2,000 miles. The jettison mechanism was brilliantly simple: a mechanical linkage connected to a lever in the cockpit. When the pilot pulled the lever, it released a hook holding the tank. Gravity did the rest. The system had to work at any speed, any altitude, and any aircraft attitude. After the initial teething problems, it achieved 99.8% reliability. The tanks fed into the aircraft's fuel system through a quick disconnect fitting. A one-way valve prevented fuel from draining back out if the tank was jettisoned. The pilot could select whether to burn fuel from the drop tanks or internal tanks first. Standard procedure was to burn drop tank fuel first, keeping internal tanks full for combat. Once the design was finalized, production scaled up massively. By mid-1944, American factories were producing over 50,000 drop tanks per month. They were considered expendable, one-use items. Every mission, thousands of drop tanks fell into the French countryside, the North Sea, and eventually Germany itself. French civilians collected them and repurposed them. Some became water troughs for livestock. Others were cut in half and turned into bathtubs or livestock feeding bins. Today, they're collector's items, a strange souvenir of the air war.
The introduction of drop tanks on the P-51 Mustang didn't just change tactics, it changed the strategic equation of the entire war. Before drop tanks, the Luftwaffe could concentrate their fighters at specific points deep in Germany, knowing American escorts couldn't reach there. They could choose when and where to fight. After drop tanks, American fighters could escort bombers anywhere in the Third Reich. The Luftwaffe had to defend everywhere, diluting their strength. They had to fight on American terms. The statistics tell the story. In the 6 months before long-range escort, July-December 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 1,085 bombers. Average loss rate, 6.2% per mission. In the 6 months after long-range escort became standard, March-August 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 1,389 bombers, but flew 3 times as many missions. Average loss rate, 3.5% per mission. That might not sound dramatic, but consider, at a 6.2% loss rate, a bomber crew's statistical chance of surviving 25 missions was less than 20%. At 3.5%, it rose to over 50%. Drop tanks saved thousands of American lives. But the real impact went beyond statistics. The ability to bomb Germany with acceptable losses meant the German oil industry was destroyed. By September 1944, German fuel production had fallen by 90%. Luftwaffe pilots couldn't train properly. Panzer divisions couldn't maneuver. The entire German war machine ground toward a halt. German aircraft production was targeted and hammered. Yes, German factories actually increased production through 1944, but they couldn't get the aircraft to operational units because transportation networks were being destroyed. And when aircraft did reach units, there wasn't fuel to fly them. The Luftwaffe bled to death. Forced to fight every day over their own territory, German fighter losses soared. Between January and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,200 fighters and, more critically, the experienced pilots flying them. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe was a spent force. Before we wrap up, if you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive. And comment below, what other simple technologies changed the course of wars? Let's discuss. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe made only 319 sorties during the entire day. The Allies flew over 14,000 sorties. Eisenhower later wrote, "The air superiority achieved by our air forces was one of the decisive factors in the campaign." That air superiority was built on the backs of P-51 pilots who could reach anywhere, anytime because of drop tanks. The drop tank seems primitive today. We have aerial refueling, which allows fighters to stay airborne indefinitely. Modern fighters can refuel from tankers, extending their range to virtually anywhere on Earth. But here's the thing. Modern fighters still use drop tanks. The F-15, F-16, F/A-18, and even the cutting-edge F-35 all can carry external fuel tanks. Why? Because sometimes you can't wait for a tanker. Sometimes you need the range right now. And sometimes you need to carry both extra fuel and weapons. The principle pioneered on the P-51 in 1944, carrying disposable external fuel to extend range, remains valid 8 decades later. But there's a deeper lesson here about innovation and warfare. The drop tank worked because it solved a real problem without requiring exotic technology or massive investment. It was low-tech, stamped aluminum, rivets, and a simple release mechanism. But it was applied correctly, at the right time, integrated into a larger system.
The P-51 Mustang is legendary, but it needed three things to become legendary: the Merlin engine, the drop tank, aggressive, well-trained pilots. Remove any one of those elements, and the P-51 doesn't change the war. There's one more thing worth mentioning: the bomber crews. When you read memoirs from B-17 and B-24 crews, there's a moment that appears again and again. They're deep over Germany, flak is bursting around them, German fighters are attacking, and then they see them, P-51s with American stars, hundreds of miles from England, flying cover. One bombardier wrote, "When I saw those Mustangs over Brunswick, I cried. I didn't know fighters could reach that far. I thought we were on our own. Seeing them there, I knew someone was looking out for us. I knew we might make it home." Drop tanks weren't glamorous. They didn't get headlines. Fighter races got the glory. But those ungainly metal canisters hanging under fighter wings represented something profound: the engineering innovation and industrial capacity that let America protect its men deep in enemy territory.
So, let's return to where we started. February 1944. American bombers are being slaughtered over Germany. The solution, everyone said, would never work: a simple metal tank bolted under a fighter's belly. Within 6 months, P-51s with drop tanks had achieved air superiority over all of Germany. The Luftwaffe was broken. Strategic bombing could proceed. The invasion of Europe could be launched. All because someone refused to accept that it couldn't be done. The drop tank isn't sexy. It doesn't have the romance of a dogfight or the drama of a bombing raid, but it's a perfect example of how wars are won, with engineering, logistics, and the willingness to try solutions that everyone says won't work. Fighter pilots initially hated drop tanks. Within months, they wouldn't fly without them. The Luftwaffe thought drop tanks made American fighters vulnerable. Instead, drop tanks made American fighters unstoppable. Sometimes the most important innovations are the simplest. Sometimes the deciding factor in a war isn't the most advanced weapon, but the most practical one. 110 gallons of fuel in an ugly aluminum tank. That's what turned the tide of the air war over Europe. The next time you see a fighter jet, look under the wings. You might see drop tanks, the same basic technology from 1944, still serving the same purpose: extending reach, projecting power, protecting lives. Some ideas are so good they never become obsolete. The drop tank is one of them. Thanks for watching this deep dive into aviation history. If you enjoyed this, subscribe, like, comment. We're building a community of people who want the real stories behind the headlines. Until next time, keep exploring history.